The village laughter broke like stones the exact second Abdul Rahman stepped out of the black SUV with 2 children at his side. In the middle of the red dirt square, a woman was on her knees, her wrapper torn, a basket of spoiled cassava spilled beside her, while villagers mocked her like she was filth. One elder shouted that shame like hers should be chased out before sunset. Then she lifted her face. Abdul froze. Amina. His breath vanished. His heart slammed against 10 years of silence, because the wife he had been told ran away in disgrace was not gone. She was here, and his entire village had gathered to humiliate her. What would you do if you came home after 10 years and found the person you loved being destroyed by the very people who should have protected them? Tell me where you're watching from and your local time. And if you love powerful emotional stories with deep twists and healing endings, subscribe and stay with me. Abdul did not remember crossing the distance between the SUV and the center of the square. 1 second he was standing beside the open car door with Quito gripping his left hand and Amara clutching the edge of his coat. The next he was in front of the woman on the ground, his shadow falling over her bent shoulders, while the village noise cracked and stumbled into uneasy silence. Up close, the truth hit harder. Amina was thinner than memory. Her cheekbones pressed sharply beneath dark skin once soft with youth. A faded scarf covered part of her hair, but not enough to hide the streaks of dust and sweat clinging to her temples. One side of her lower lip was split. Her hands, those careful hands that had once sewn his shirts by lantern light and traced prayers over his forehead before dawn, were rough, scraped and trembling against the dirt, and yet her eyes were still hers, wide, steady, deep enough to drown a man in regret. Abdul's voice came out raw. Who touched her? No one answered. The villagers who had been loud seconds earlier suddenly studied the sky, the ground, the torn cassava basket, anything but his face. A few men stepped back. A few women pulled their wrappers tighter around themselves. The children who had been laughing hid behind their mothers' legs. At the edge of the crowd stood Mzi Baraka, the village elder, a tall old man with a carved walking stick and a beard that used to make Abdul think of wisdom. Now he looked less like wisdom and more like a witness caught in daylight. It is not what you think, the elder said at last. Abdul turned slowly. His silence was more frightening than a shout. Then explain what I am seeing. Mzi Baraka cleared his throat. This woman created trouble again. Amina's fingers twitched on the ground, but she did not speak. Abdul heard the word woman, not wife. Trouble, not wound. Again, as if humiliation had become routine enough to need no explanation. He crouched in front of Amina. Very carefully, as though sudden movement might shatter them both, he reached for her arm. She flinched. That flinch went through him like a blade. Not because she feared a stranger, because some part of her had learned to fear hands coming too close. Quito made a soft sound behind him. Amara leaned against the SUV, staring with wide, unsettled eyes at the kneeling woman in the dust. Abdul swallowed. Amina, he said quieter this time. Look at me. Her eyes lifted fully to his. Shock moved through them first. Then disbelief. Then something more dangerous than either pain so old it had learned how to sit still. You shouldn't have come back, she whispered. The words landed with the weight of a confession. Around them murmurs fluttered through the crowd. So they knew him, or at least they knew enough. Abdul stood again, and when he did, he removed his jacket without looking away from anyone. He draped it over Amina's shoulders. The movement was simple, almost gentle, but it made the square feel like a courtroom. He turned to the villagers. I asked who touched her. This time a woman answered before fear could stop her. She stole from the market. Another voice came quickly, eager, sharp. She brought rotten cassava to sell and lied about the weight. She cursed at Mama Salama. She owes money. She always brings shame. The accusations piled up too fast, too practiced, like stones already held in waiting hands. Abdul listened. His face changed with each sentence, not into rage, not yet, but into something colder, more precise. Then he looked down at the spilled cassava. Half the tubers were grey and soft with rot. Half were fresh. Not enough to accuse a thief. Enough to accuse hunger. Who sold these to her? He asked. No answer. Who weighed them? Silence. Who witnessed the exchange? More silence. Amina closed her eyes for one short second, as though each question exposed not just the lie, but the village's willingness to live inside it. Abdul had built companies across 3 countries. He had seen executives lie, politicians smile while stripping families bare, investors hide knives inside silk promises. He knew the sound of falsehood. He knew how people behaved when a lie was weak and a crowd was needed to strengthen it. This square was full of that sound. Amara stepped forward at last, unable to hold back. She was only 8, all narrow shoulders and fierce little eyes with braids decorated in blue beads that clicked softly when she moved. Why were they laughing at her? She asked. Nobody answered the child either. Kito, older by 2 years and quieter by nature, looked at Amina's bruised wrist and then at Abdul. Baba, he said carefully, did they hurt her because of us? The question cut deeper than any accusation from the crowd. A ripple moved through the villagers at the boy's use of that word. Baba. Father. There it was, the assumption they had already made, the one Abdul had seen forming in their eyes, the second he stepped from the vehicle with 2 children. Their missing son had returned, rich, polished, powerful, and not alone. Of course the children must be his. Of course the woman in the dust must be the abandoned wife. Of course that would make this humiliation acceptable, expected even. Abdul looked from Kito to the villagers. He saw it clearly. Then some pitied Amina, some hated her, some enjoyed the spectacle, but most had already arranged the story in their heads. Abdul left. Abdul found another life. Abdul returned too late. Therefore Amina must deserve whatever had happened in his absence. Convenient stories always protected cowards. No, Abdul said to Kito, though his eyes remained on the crowd. Not because of you. Amina let out a faint breath. It was the first time she looked at the children directly. Her gaze softened. That startled him more than anything else. Not jealousy, not bitterness, not suspicion. Compassion. Amara moved closer to Abdul's side. Who is she? She whispered. Before he could answer, Mama Salama pushed forward from the crowd. She was a thick-set trader with a bright orange head wrap and the kind of mouth that sharpened whenever an audience gathered. She is the woman who ruined herself, Mama Salama said loudly. She disappeared, came back empty, and now survives by begging pity. Amina's jaw tightened. Her eyes dropped again, not in surrender, but in endurance. Abdul felt something dark gather in his chest. Begging pity, he repeated. Mama Salama folded her arms. Everyone knows she was sent away. Everyone knows she was no longer wanted. The air shifted. Sent away. Not ran away. The difference was tiny in sound, vast in meaning. Abdul stared at her. Who sent her away? Mama Salama realized too late what she had revealed. I only meant, you meant what you said. Mzibaraka struck his stick against the ground. Enough. This is a family matter. Abdul's head snapped toward him. Exactly. The elder hesitated. And in that hesitation, Abdul saw it. Not confusion, not ignorance. Knowledge. Hidden, suppressed, guarded knowledge. His pulse slowed, which always meant danger. The colder he became, the more dangerous he was. Amina knew that once. Maybe she still did. Because when she looked up at him again, Fear flickered across her face, but not fear of him. Fear of what he was beginning to understand. 10 years ago, he had received a letter in Nairobi. Amina had written that she was leaving, that she was ashamed, that he must never come looking for her. The words had burned him alive then. He had read them until the paper softened at the folds. He had believed them because grief always believes what it fears most. But Amina had never used the phrase "no longer wanted," and she had never asked for pity. He knew the rhythm of her silence, the dignity of it, the stubborn pride. He looked down at her split lip, at the jacket slipping over her bruised shoulders, at the cassava in the dirt, at the children standing behind him watching adults fail the simplest test of humanity. Then he understood something else. This was not the first time the village had done this to her. It was only the first time he had seen it. Abdul drew in a long breath and made his decision with the clean certainty of a blade leaving its sheath. He turned back to the crowd. "Listen to me carefully," he said. No one moved. "This woman is my wife." Gasps broke like dry branches. Amina shut her eyes. Quito and Amara looked up at him, stunned but silent. And before this day ends, Abdul continued, each word landing harder than the last. "I will know exactly who lied to me, who lied about her, and who stood here watching while my wife was treated like dirt." His voice dropped lower. "And when I know none of you will hide behind the village, behind age, behind custom, or behind God." The square had never felt so still. Then Amina spoke for the first time with something stronger than pain. "Abdul," she said, barely above a whisper, "if you start digging, the truth will bury more than one person." He turned to her. In her eyes he saw warning. In her silence he saw history. And in the way the elder looked suddenly afraid, Abdul knew one thing with terrible certainty. Amina had not left him. Amina had been left here. Nobody in the square spoke after that. The silence did not feel empty. It felt crowded with fear, with memory, with the weight of things that had been hidden too long. Even the wind seemed to hesitate, dragging red dust in a thin line across the ground between Abdul and the villagers who had mocked his wife minutes earlier. Amina was still kneeling. That was the detail Abdul could not forgive. Not the gossip, not the lies, not even the cowardice in the elder's eyes. It was the fact that no one had told her to rise. No one had offered water. No one had covered her shoulders. A whole village had watched her in the dirt, as if suffering had become her proper place. Abdul bent and held out his hand again. This time Amina stared at it for a long moment before taking it. Her fingers were colder than he expected. He helped her to her feet slowly, feeling the tremor in her body, the stiffness in her left side, the effort it took for her not to lean on him. She was trying to stand with dignity even now, even half bruised, even in front of the people who had stripped her of it again and again. His jacket slid from one shoulder. Amara rushed forward and caught it before it fell. The girl looked up at Amina with serious, wounded eyes. "You can keep it," she said softly. Something flickered across Amina's face. Surprise first, then a tenderness so quick and fragile that Abdul almost thought he imagined it. "Thank you," Amina whispered. Quito had not moved. He stood a few steps back, shoulders stiff, staring at the crowd with a quiet intensity that reminded Abdul painfully of himself at that age. Quito was 10 old enough to observe what other children missed, old enough to know when adults were lying, old enough to understand humiliation without having words for its full cruelty. His gaze shifted from Amina to Abdul. "Are we leaving?" he asked. The question seemed simple. It was not. Abdul looked at the road beyond the square, the one he had driven down less than 20 minutes earlier, thinking he was returning to a place that still belonged to memory. He had imagined a reunion, maybe a bitter one, maybe full of tears, but still private. Human. He had not imagined rescuing his wife from public disgrace while 2 children watched. He had not imagined that staying would mean tearing open 10 years of buried rot in front of everyone. But he also knew something with perfect clarity. If he took Amina and the children away now, without answers, the lies would follow them. The village would simply reshape the story. Abdul returned rich and stole away the shameless woman he once cast aside. Or worse, he pitied her and took her as charity. No. The truth had to be dragged into daylight here where the lie had lived. "We are not leaving yet," Abdul said. A ripple of unease moved through the villagers. Mzi Baraka tightened his grip on the walking stick. "This is no place for children." Abdul turned to him. "You should have remembered that before humiliating a woman in front of them." The elder's jaw worked, but no words came. Mama Salama muttered under her breath and bent to gather the spilled cassava into the broken basket. Abdul noticed how hurriedly she worked now, as if cleaning the evidence might clean her conscience. It did neither. Amina swayed once. He felt it before he saw it. Without asking permission, Abdul placed a steadying hand near her elbow. She stiffened, then forced herself still. Her eyes stayed forward on the villagers, not on him. Up close he could see the exhaustion beneath her control. The pulse in her throat was too fast. Dust clung to the wet corners of her eyes, though she had not cried. "Sit down," he murmured. "I'm fine. You can barely stand." "I said I'm fine." The edge in her voice was weak, but it was still there. Still Amina. He almost laughed at the pain of hearing it. Before he could answer, Amara stepped closer, holding the jacket firmly around Amina's shoulders with both hands, as if she had already decided this woman needed guarding. "You are not fine," the girl said matter-of-factly. "Your lip is bleeding." A few villagers exchanged glances. Some looked uncomfortable now, some irritated, some merely curious to see how this scene would evolve. Abdul hated them for that curiosity almost as much as for the cruelty that had created it. Amina looked down at Amara. "You speak boldly." Amara lifted her chin. "Only when something is wrong." For the first time, the shadow of a real expression touched Amina's face. It was not a smile exactly, more like the memory of one. Quito finally stepped forward too. He held a bottle of water he had taken from the vehicle. He offered it without speaking. Amina hesitated before accepting it. Her fingers brushed his. That small contact changed the air. It was subtle, so subtle that most of the villagers missed it. But Abdul saw it. Amina's breath caught, not with discomfort, not with suspicion. Recognition of something emotional rather than logical. A softness, immediate and unguarded, passed through her expression as she looked at the boy. "Thank you," she said again, but this time the words sounded different. Quito's eyes narrowed slightly, studying her with the same strange concentration he gave difficult puzzles. "You look like someone who used to sing," he said. A few villagers snorted in disbelief. Abdul's head turned sharply toward the boy. Amina went still. What Abdul asked? Quito shrugged, embarrassed now that everyone was watching. "I don't know. She looks like it." Amina lowered her gaze to the water bottle in her hand. "I used to," she said quietly. That answer should not have struck Abdul the way it did. But it did. Because 10 years ago, before everything shattered, Amina sang while grinding millet, while washing clothes, while lighting the evening lamp. She sang when she was happy, when she was tired, when she was worried, and thought no one noticed. Her voice had been the background of his early life, the shape of home without walls. And Quito, who had never met her, had seen that in her face within seconds. The crowd stirred again. One of the younger men, tall and thin with a scar along his jaw, spoke up from the back. "If she is truly your wife, why bring other children to her doorstep after 10 years? The question hit its target. Abdul heard the malice in it instantly, not curiosity, a trap. Amina's shoulders tightened under the jacket. There it was, the story the village preferred. The abandoned wife. the rich husband returning with proof of betrayal trailing behind him in two small bodies. Abdul was about to answer, but Quito spoke first. "We are not his children." The square seemed to inhale. Quito's voice was calm, but it carried. He looked not at the man who had spoken, but at Amina. "My father was Abdul's friend," he said. "He died." Amara came to stand beside him. "And our mother died too." No child should have to explain his existence to a crowd of adults. Abdul felt shame burn through him, not for the children, never for them, but for the fact that they had been dragged into ugliness they did not deserve. "We live with him," Quito continued, "because he promised." Amina's face changed. The shift was immediate and devastating. Whatever pieces of the story she had assembled in her own wounded mind shattered and rearranged at once. The suspicion Abdul had glimpsed beneath her control, the pain she had swallowed when she first saw the children beside him, the fear that the villagers' version of him had become true. It all broke open in her eyes. She looked at Abdul, then really looked at him. And in that look, he saw 10 years of ache crash against one fragile new possibility. "You kept a promise," she said. He held her gaze. Yes, the crowd, disappointed by the collapse of one scandal, rushed to replace it with another. Convenient. Who can prove that? Maybe that is another story made for pity. Abdul's patience thinned to a blade. But before he could speak, Amina did something that startled him even more than her earlier gentleness with the children. She stepped half a pace in front of them, not fully, not dramatically, just enough for her body to create the first small line of protection between the children and the villagers' words. It was instinctive, maternal, and it hit him with a force he was not ready for. Amara noticed it too. She moved closer to Amina's side without seeming to think about it. The women in the crowd saw it next. Their faces shifted with the troubled recognition of something they understood too well, whatever else Amina had suffered. The sight of orphaned children beside a man she once loved had not made her cruel. It had made her protective. Mama Salama straightened from the cassava basket, flustered by the turn of the moment. "We do not know what stories are true anymore," No Abdul said, "but I intend to find out." He looked across the square, letting his gaze settle on each face long enough to unsettle it. Mama Salama, the scar-jawed man. Mzee Baraka, two older women whispering behind their hands. Qasim was not there, Amina's older brother. Abdul noticed that absence immediately. Too convenient. Where there was a lie, there was always someone avoiding the first storm. Abdul turned to Amina. "Can you walk? Yes." It was another stubborn answer and another lie, but it was less of one than before. He nodded toward the shaded veranda of the closed trading post at the edge of the square. "You will sit there for 5 minutes. I do not take orders from you." That would have amused him once. Now it only hurt. "No," he said softly. "But I am asking." Amina's mouth pressed into a thin line. Then, to the astonishment of half the village, she allowed Amara to guide her toward the veranda, while Quito carried the water bottle beside them like a solemn little guard. Abdul stayed where he was until she sat down on the low wooden bench beneath the shade. Only then did he face the village again. The dust moved between them like smoke. "When I left this village, he said I thought poverty was its greatest wound." Nobody spoke. I was wrong. He let the words settle. "Cowardice is," Mzee Baraka bristled. "Mind your tongue, Abdul. You first." The elder's face darkened. Abdul took one step forward. "I want to know who told this village that Amina was no longer wanted." No answer. "I want to know who wrote the lies after I left." Silence. "I want to know where Qasim is." That one hit. Eyes shifted instantly. Too many of them, too fast. And there it was. Not truth yet, but direction. Abdul followed those glances, and in them he found the next door. Amina had not hated the children. The village had not expected him to ask questions, and Qasim Amina's own blood was hiding from whatever came next. Abdul's voice dropped quiet enough now that the villagers had to lean in to hear it. "Good," he said. "That means we're finally getting close." By late afternoon, the square had changed shape. The mockery was gone, but its stain remained in the dust, in the overturned basket, in the silence that followed Abdul like a second shadow. No one returned to normal business. The market stalls stayed half open. The women who had been bargaining over tomatoes now stood in knots, whispering behind their hands. Boys who should have been chasing one another through the red road lingered near fences and doorways, pretending not to stare. A village never stopped watching. It only changed the angle. Amina sat beneath the shaded veranda of the old trading post with Amara beside her, and Quito leaning against one of the wooden pillars. Abdul had sent his driver away with the SUV to wait by the mosque at the edge of the village. He did not want the black vehicle looming over the square like a threat from another world. This reckoning had to happen on village ground under village eyes. Amina had washed her face with the bottled water Quito gave her. The blood at her lip was gone now, but the swelling remained. She had folded Abdul's jacket neatly over her lap, as if refusing to wear it longer than necessary. Even bruised, even exhausted, she still carried herself with that stubborn dignity that made softness look like strength. Abdul stood a few feet away, speaking quietly to Quito. "If anyone raises their voice at her again," he said, "you go to the veranda and stay with Amara. Do not step between adults fighting." Quito's jaw tightened. What if they try to touch her again? Abdul looked at him. The boy's eyes were not frightened now. They were angry. "You still do not step between them," Abdul said. "You stay with your sister and you let me handle it." Quito wanted to argue. Abdul could see it, but he nodded. Amara, who had been listening despite pretending not to cross her arms. "I can shout very loudly." Amina turned her face away quickly, but Abdul caught the flicker of almost laughter that moved through her expression. It struck him like a memory of sunlight through storm clouds. Then a shadow fell across the edge of the veranda. An old woman stood there, barefoot, shoulders bent from years of labor, a patterned cloth wrapped tightly over graying hair. Abdul recognized her only after a second look. Nyasha. She had once worked in his mother's house when he was a boy. She used to smell of wood smoke and shea butter. She had fed him roasted ground nuts when Mama Zuri was too busy receiving visitors to notice whether her son had eaten. Now her eyes moved nervously across the square before landing on Amina. "I should not be here," Nyasha whispered. Amina straightened slightly. "Then why are you?" The old woman looked at Abdul. "Because silence is beginning to poison even those who swallowed it." That was answer enough. Abdul motioned toward the far end of the veranda, away from the growing cluster of listeners. He did not need to ask whether villagers were already trying to overhear. Of course they were. He only needed enough distance to make people work for every stolen word. Nyasha sat on the edge of the bench, her hands knotted together. Up close, Abdul noticed how badly they shook. "Where is Qasim?" he asked first. Nyasha gave a harsh little breath. "Gone since noon. Someone warned him you were asking questions." Amina closed her eyes for a brief second. Not surprise. Confirmation. Abdul's voice remained level. "And my mother?" "At the big house," Nyasha said. "Where else would she be? She says a son returns when he is ready to kneel to his blood." Something cold passed behind Abdul's ribs. Mama Zuri had always loved hierarchy more than love itself. Amina looked down at the jacket in her lap. "You should leave her out of this." Abdul turned to her. "If she is innocent, I will." Amina did not answer, and that silence said more than any confession. Nyasha's gaze darted between them. "I did not come to speak in riddles," she said. "I came because the letter was not hers. The world did not stop. It narrowed." Abdul heard children shouting somewhere far off, a goat pulling against a rope, a cellar banging dust from a mat. Everything continued, but inside him one sentence had already torn open the day. "Say it again," he said. "The letter you received 10 years ago," Nyasha whispered. "It was not written by Amina." Even Amina went still at that. Abdul had known it in his bones the moment he heard the phrase "no longer wanted" in the square. But instinct was not proof. This was. "Who wrote it?" he asked. Nyasha wet her lips. Fear made her voice thin. "I did not see the hand, but I saw the room. I saw the paper. I saw your mother send away the messenger who brought the first note Amina wrote." Amina's head lifted sharply. "I wrote 3 letters. Abdul turned toward her so fast the bench creaked beneath Nyasha. What Amina stared at him with naked disbelief. "I wrote 3. 1 after you left for Nairobi. 1 when no answer came. 1 when she stopped, when what Abdul pressed." Her throat worked. "When I knew I was carrying your child." The words struck the air like lightning without thunder. Amara looked from one adult to the other, confused but quiet. Kito's body stiffened, his young face suddenly solemn. Abdul's mouth went dry. "You wrote that?" Amina gave a small, shattered laugh with no joy in it. "I wrote everything. I wrote that I was frightened. I wrote that your mother would not let me inside the house. I wrote that Qasim told me to wait because you were busy building your life and would return when you were ready. I wrote that I did not care about the waiting. I only needed the truth." Nyasha nodded miserably. "I saw one of the letters. She begged only for honesty." Abdul felt the veranda tilt under him, though he remained standing. 3 letters. He had received one. One sharp, humiliating page that told him to stay away. One page so unlike Amina in its bitterness that he had still chosen to believe it, because grief always chooses the wound that seems final. He had hated himself for months after reading it. Hated her too. Hated the part of his love that still wanted to run back and demand her face, her voice, her reason. And all that time she had been writing into a wall built by people he called family. "Who stopped them?" he asked, though the question was already answered. Nyasha's eyes lowered. "Your mother." A silence followed that confession, but it was not clean. It was filled with old betrayals rushing to the surface. Amina stared at nothing. "I knew." Abdul looked at her. "You knew?" "Not at first," she said. "At first I thought you had changed. That city money had swallowed the village man I married. Then I thought maybe you believed the stories about me. Then I thought maybe—" Her voice frayed. She gathered it again. "By the time I understood letters were disappearing, it was too late to prove anything." Abdul took one step back, as if distance could make the guilt less physical. "Why didn't you come to Nairobi?" Amina looked at him with calm devastation. "With what money? Under whose protection, carrying whose child? While your mother's people watched every step I took." He had no answer. Nyasha rubbed her palms together. "There is more." "Of course there was. There is always more," Abdul said. The old woman's eyes filled with tears. She seemed ashamed to let fall. "The envelope you received came from the house. I know because I sealed it." Amina's fingers tightened on the folded jacket. Abdul's voice lowered dangerously. "You sealed a lie and said nothing." Nyasha flinched. "I was a servant in your mother's house. I had 4 children to feed. And my wife had none," he snapped. The old woman bowed her head. Shame rolled off her like heat. Amina spoke before the cruelty in him could go further. "Enough." Abdul turned sharply toward her. She looked exhausted, but her gaze held. Do not spend your anger on the weakest person in the chain. She helped them. She survived them, Amina said. There is a difference. That landed. Because it was true. Because Amina, of all people, understood what survival cost inside systems built by stronger hands. Nyasha drew a shaking breath. The letter was written in your mother's room, but not by her alone. Abdul's eyes narrowed. Who? The old woman hesitated. Then footsteps sounded on the road outside the veranda. Quick, uneven, nervous. A teenage boy Abdul did not know stopped at the steps, panting. Mzi Baraka is sending men to the upper path, he blurted. They think Qasim is trying to reach the river road. There it was again, panic moving before truth. Abdul looked at the boy. Who told you to bring me this? The boy pointed toward the market well. A thin child stood there, half hidden behind a stack of water gourds. Barefoot, narrow shoulders, torn shirt, too big for his frame. He could not have been older than 12. When Abdul met his eyes, the boy almost bolted. But Amina saw him too, and something softened in her immediately. Malik, she said. The boy froze. Nyasha whispered, He is the one who sometimes carries food to her at night. The child shifted uneasily, caught between fear and loyalty. Amina lifted a hand, slow and gentle. Come. After a long hesitation, Malik approached. Every step carried caution learned from too much rejection. Yet when he reached the veranda, he stood close to Amina without seeming to think about it, as if her presence was the only place in the village where his body had learned to loosen. Mzi Baraka said Abdul must leave before sunset. Malik said, staring at the floor. He said family shame should stay inside family walls. Abdul almost smiled, but there was no humor in it. Then he is afraid. Malik nodded once. Amina looked at the boy. Did you hear where Qasim was going? The river road, Malik said. To meet a motorcycle. Nyasha made a distressed sound. If he reaches town, he will bury the truth before dawn. Abdul's mind moved quickly now the way it did in boardrooms just before a deal broke open. Qasim was running. Mzi Baraka was covering movement. Mama Zuri was waiting at the big house, secure in whatever version of power she still believed in. And Nyasha had just handed him the first hard piece of the buried past. But one part still cut louder than all the rest. He looked at Amina. You said the third letter told me about the baby. Amina's face emptied. For a moment he thought she would refuse to answer. Instead, she said with the quiet of someone reopening a grave, Yes. And when no reply came, her voice was almost flat now. I understood I was alone. No accusation, no theatrics, just a fact sharp enough to break a man. Abdul lowered his head briefly. When he lifted it again, whatever softness remained in him had turned into resolve. He faced Nyasha. You said my mother was not alone in writing that letter. Nyasha's lips trembled. Then she spoke the name that made Amina go pale and Abdul feel the entire buried structure shift beneath them. Qasim held the first draft, she whispered. And he was the one who told Mama Zuri what words would hurt you enough to stay away. For a long moment after Nyasha spoke, no one on the veranda moved. The village noises still drifted through the evening air. Goats bleating somewhere behind a fence. Women calling children home. The clang of a metal basin from the far end of the market road. But around Abdul, everything felt stunned into stillness. Qasim. Of all people. Not just a coward who had stayed silent, not just a brother who had failed to protect his sister. A participant, a man who had helped choose the exact words that would cut Abdul away from her. Amina sat with both hands folded tightly over the jacket in her lap. Her knuckles had gone pale beneath the dust on her skin. She did not look surprised. That was what made Abdul's stomach turn. How long have you known? He asked. Amina kept her eyes on the wooden floorboards for a second before lifting them. Known, she repeated quietly. Not from his mouth. Men like Qasim do not confess until the fire reaches their own door. But suspected. She gave a tired, bitter smile that vanished almost at once. For years. Abdul stared at her. And you said nothing. Her gaze sharpened. To whom? The question struck with humiliating force. To whom indeed? To the village elder who liked peace more than justice. To Mama Zuri, who had hated her before marriage and only smiled in public. To neighbors who fed on shame like it was millet. To Abdul, a man in another city who had never answered a single letter she wrote because every letter had been intercepted. Amina saw the answer forming in his face and lowered her eyes again. I had no proof, she said. Only patterns. The kind poor women notice because patterns are the only warning we get before men call their cruelty fate. Nyasha let out a slow breath, as if Amina's words had pressed on an old bruise in her own chest. Malik stood at the edge of the veranda with tense shoulders, glancing toward the road every few seconds. He was ready to bolt with another message if needed. Quito watched everyone in silence, old enough to understand that something bigger than gossip was unfolding, young enough to hate that he could not force it to stop. Amara sat close to Amina now, one small hand resting on the bench beside her, not touching, just near. Close enough to say, I'm here. Abdul drew in a breath that did nothing to steady him. What happened after I left? He asked. Amina's face changed. That simple question asked for 10 years, but he did not yet realize it. He saw it only when she gave a short, empty laugh and turned her face toward the open square beyond the veranda. Which part? She said. It was not disrespect. It was exhaustion. The kind that comes when pain has too many chapters. Abdul forced himself to sit on the opposite end of the bench, leaving space between them because too much had happened for closeness to be assumed. He rested his forearms on his knees, hands clasped, and looked at the dust. Start with the child, he said. The air tightened. Nyasha lowered her head. Quito and Amara went very still. Malik stared openly now, his thin face full of alarm and concern. Amina took a long time to answer. When you left for Nairobi, she said. At last I still believed distance meant something temporary. Hard, but temporary. You promised to send for me when things were stable. I believed you because you had never lied to me. Abdul closed his eyes briefly. I waited, she continued. The first month I counted the days. The second month I counted the excuses people gave me. By the third month your mother had already decided I was an embarrassment she would not carry into your new life. Nyasha nodded slowly. Tears in her eyes now. She had likely seen more than she ever admitted. Amina's voice remained calm, which somehow made every word more brutal. At first it was small things. I was no longer allowed through the front gate of the big house. Food that used to be sent for me stopped arriving. Women who had smiled at my wedding began speaking to me as if I were a servant who had overstayed her welcome. Then the whispers began. She looked at Abdul. That city had changed you, that rich men do not return for village wives, that perhaps you had already found someone more suitable. Abdul's jaw hardened. I wrote to you after the first whisper, Amina said. Then, after the first public insult. Then again, when I realized I had missed my bleeding 2 months in a row. Amara frowned, not fully understanding. Quito did. His young face tightened. Abdul felt it too. The moment the truth became flesh. She had not only written to him about fear, she had written to him carrying hope, carrying his child, carrying a future that was supposed to belong to both of them. And still nothing came back. Amina said. No message, no money, no word, only more stories from your mother. She said a man building an empire cannot drag a village woman behind him like a cooking pot. Nyasha covered her mouth. Malik looked furious in the blunt, uncomplicated way only hungry children can. Abdul spoke through teeth that barely wanted to part. "She said that to you?" She said worse. He almost stood, almost walked straight to the big house that minute and dragged the walls down around his mother's pride. But Amina was not finished, and something in her face told him the true wound had not yet come. "What happened when people knew you were pregnant?" he asked. Amina's fingers tightened around the folded jacket. "Qasim knew before anyone," she said. "I told him because he was my brother." A humorless silence followed that sentence, the kind that comes when the meaning of family has already rotted. "He told me to keep quiet until we heard from you," she continued. "He said if your mother learned I was carrying a child, she might use it to pull me deeper under her control. I wanted to believe he was protecting me." Abdul looked at her profile, at the steadiness she forced into it. "But he was already talking to her," Abdul said. Amina nodded once. "I learned that too late." A faint breeze moved through the veranda, carrying the smell of evening cooking fires. Smoke, palm oil, pepper. Home once. Now it smelled like accusation. "What did they do?" Abdul asked. Amina's voice dropped lower. "They waited until the rains began. No one moved. The first drops had started falling somewhere outside, as if memory itself had called them. Amina stared into the open air, but Abdul knew she was no longer seeing the village square. She was seeing the night. "Your mother sent for me," she said. "She told me she had finally received word from Nairobi. She said you did not want scandal while your business was growing. She said the child would ruin your future if people believed you had tied yourself permanently to a poor girl from the village before making your name." Abdul's head snapped toward her. "She told you I did not want my own child." Amina's lips trembled once, then flattened. "Yes." He could not breathe for a second. "I did not believe her at first," Amina said. "Not fully. But doubt is a cruel thing when it enters a woman already standing alone." Qasim was there too. He did not look at me. He kept saying, "Listen, be wise, think of survival." Nyasha began to cry silently. Amina did not look at her. "I left that house dizzy," she went on. "The sky broke before I reached home. Rain everywhere, mud everywhere. I remember holding one hand over my stomach while trying not to fall. By the time I reached my room, the pain had started. Abdul's entire body went rigid. Amara, sensing the shift, though not understanding everything, slid one small hand into Amina's. Amina did not pull away. "I sent for help," Amina said. "First to Qasim, then to the elder's wife, then to the big house. No one came." Mzibaraka's name had not even been spoken, yet his shadow seemed to enter the veranda. Why, Abdul asked, though the answer would be unbearable no matter what form it took. Amina finally looked at him fully. "Because by then she said they had decided my pain was useful." The words entered him like iron. She swallowed. "If I lost the child, there would be no evidence tying you to me forever. If I lived, I would remain shamed and dependent. If I died—" She let the sentence trail off. No one asked her to finish it. The rain outside thickened. It tapped the roof and darkened the dust beyond the veranda into muddy red. "I walked to the clinic alone," Amina said. Abdul bowed his head. "Not all the way. I tried." Her voice cracked for the first time. "I made it as far as the old baobab near the lower road before the pain became too strong. I fell there, in the mud. By the time someone found me in the morning, it was over." Silence swallowed the veranda whole. Quito had turned his face away. His eyes were wet, and he clearly hated that fact. Amara pressed herself against Amina's side, now fully no longer pretending this was temporary kindness. Malik stood with clenched fists, jaw shaking with helpless fury. Nyasha whispered, "I found you." Amina nodded. "Yes." The old woman's shoulders sagged under remembered guilt. There was so much blood, she said brokenly. And still Mama Zuri said it was God correcting a mistake. Abdul stood so abruptly the bench scraped hard against the wood. For a second everyone looked at him. He walked to the edge of the veranda and braced both hands on a pillar, staring into the rain. He was no longer in control of his breathing. He could hear it harsh, uneven, close to breaking. The image had already formed in his mind without mercy. Amina alone in the mud, one hand on her belly, waiting for help from people who had measured her suffering and found it convenient. Their child. Their son, their daughter. He would never know. He closed his eyes. In some other life, that child might have had Amina's eyes and his stubborn mouth, might have run through this village before ever learning how ugly adults could be, might have sat at a table between them, might have made all the waiting worth it. Instead, there had been rain, blood, silence. Amina's voice came behind him, quieter now. I stopped writing after that. He turned. She had tears on her face at last, but she was not weeping. They simply existed as unavoidable as the rain. I thought either you had abandoned me, she said, or you had been turned into someone I no longer knew. And if the second was true, then I would not beg for what was dead. Abdul stepped back toward her slowly. I sent money, he said, his voice raw. Twice in the first year. Once through a man from Nairobi, once through the bank agent in town. Both were returned with messages saying you had refused them. Amina's expression changed sharply. I never saw any money. Nyasha let out a shattered exhale. Mama Zuri. Qasim too, Abdul said, the pieces locking together. He would have needed access to your name, your mark, your claim. He helped block everything. Amina pressed a hand against her mouth. It was too much at once. Abdul saw it. The grief, the vindication, the rage, the twisted relief of finally having the shape of betrayal instead of just its bruise. He knelt in front of her, then not touching, just lowering himself until they were level. I did not leave you in that rain, he said. Her eyes searched his face. For 10 years, Abdul continued, you carried what they did as if it proved something about your worth. It proved only their cruelty. Not your worth. A tear slipped down the side of her face. And for 10 years, he said, I carried the shame of believing you could cast me away that easily. That shame belongs elsewhere too. Amina's lips parted, but no words came. Then Malik spoke from the edge of the veranda, breathless with urgency. A motorcycle just passed the river road, he said. 2 men. One had Qasim's blue shawl. Abdul stood. The rain no longer sounded like grief. It sounded like pursuit. The rain came down hard enough to blur the far side of the square. For a moment, nobody on the veranda moved. The words motorcycle, river road, and Qasim's blue shawl hung in the air like a command that had not yet decided whose body it would enter. Then Abdul was already moving. He crossed the veranda in 3 long strides, reached the steps, and stopped only because Amina's voice hit him from behind. Do not go alone. He turned. She was on her feet. It should not have been possible. Not after everything she had just reopened. Not with the exhaustion still visible in her face and the old pain still trembling through her body. But she stood anyway, one hand braced briefly on the bench before she let it go. Amara instantly rose beside her. You should sit. Amina shook her head. Quito came forward too, rainlight reflecting in his dark, serious eyes. If that man runs away, he said, he will keep lying. The bluntness of childhood sliced straight through the adult's hesitation. Abdul looked toward the road again. The square had almost emptied now. Doors were half closed. Faces hovered behind curtains and fence gaps. Villagers who had loved spectacle an hour ago suddenly preferred distance now that the spectacle threatened to demand truth. Mzee Baraka was nowhere in sight. That alone was confession. Nyasha wrapped her shawl tighter around herself. The elder sent men to the river road, but not to stop Qasim. To warn him, Abdul said. Nyasha nodded miserably. Malik, drenched already from running, stood at the edge of the steps with the rigid stillness of a child who had learned to wait for orders because life rarely gave him choices. I know the short path, he said. Through the cassava fields. Abdul's first instinct was to refuse. The boy was too young, too thin, too breakable for what the next minutes might hold. Then he remembered another boy himself learning very early that adults only called children children when it was convenient. When they needed courage, speed, silence, or suffering, children suddenly became useful. He crouched to Malik's level. You do not come close if you see men fighting. You hear me? Malik nodded once. You point the way and stay back. Another nod. Amina stepped closer, the folded jacket still around her shoulders. Take Quito and Amara to the car, Abdul said without looking at her. No, said Amara immediately. Yes, Abdul said. No. Quito echoed quieter but firmer. Not now. Abdul straightened and looked at both children. This is not for you. Quito held his gaze. Neither was watching people humiliate her. That landed with enough force to silence everyone for a beat. Abdul saw too much in the boy's face, then loyalty, anger, helplessness, and something more painful than all three, the desperate need not to be sent away every time truth became dangerous. Quito had already lost one father to death. He did not trust disappearance even when it was called protection. Amara crossed her arms, rain speckling the blue beads at the ends of her braids. I'm not scared, she declared. Amina looked down at the girl, and despite everything, the faintest curve touched her mouth again. Not joy, but recognition. Abdul dragged a hand over his face. The situation was becoming impossible in 6 directions at once. Then Amina solved part of it. They stay with Nyasha, she said. Inside the trading post, door closed, no matter what they hear. Abdul turned to protest, but Amina met his eyes with a steadiness that stopped him. You need to move, she said, not argue. The old command in her voice startled both of them. Years ago, before Nairobi, before betrayal, before all the grave dirt silence between them, Amina had sounded like that when storms were coming and grain needed bringing in. Practical, clear, unafraid to cut through emotion when action mattered more. Abdul gave one short nod. Quito started to object, saw Abdul's face and stopped. Amara looked furious, which was at least better than frightened. Nyasha gathered both children toward the trading post door, one frail hand surprisingly firm at their shoulders. Come, she said, you can guard from inside better than outside. That is not true, Amara muttered. It is tonight, Nyasha replied. Malik was already halfway down the steps pointing into the rain. Abdul went after him. Amina followed. He heard her turn and swore under his breath. You are not coming through mud and fields in this condition, and you are not going to face my brother without me, she shot back. That might have been madness. It might also have been the only sane thing anyone had said. Because Qasim would lie more easily if Amina was absent. He would twist the past into pity for himself. Claim confusion, claim manipulation, claim family pressure, claim anything that turned him from architect into victim. Men like him always did. Abdul saw that Amina knew this too. So he did not argue again. Rain hammered the roofs as they cut behind the market and onto the narrow path through the cassava fields. Malik ran ahead, barefoot and light weaving through the mud, with the precision of someone who had grown up navigating places where nobody paved the way for him. Abdul followed fast enough to keep him in sight. Amina came behind, slower but relentless, lifting her wrapper clear of the thick red mud that tried to claim every step. The village sounds faded behind them. The world narrowed to rain breath and the slap of feet against wet earth. At the edge of the fields, Malik stopped sharply and pointed. Down below, near the river road, 2 figures stood beside a motorcycle tilted under an acacia tree. One man was adjusting a sack tied behind the seat. The other was arguing with him, gesturing wildly despite the rain. Even through the curtain of water, the blue shawl was unmistakable. Qasim. Abdul felt something inside him go utterly still. "Stay here," he told Malik. The boy nodded, crouching low behind a wall of cassava leaves. Amina had already seen her brother. For a second, Abdul thought her knees might fail. Not from weakness, from the brutal collision between memory and fact. A brother once trusted, a brother now preparing to flee. Then she straightened. "Call him Abdul," said. She looked at him. "Why me?" "Because if I shout first, he will run." Amina stared through the rain. Her face hardened into something Abdul had never seen before. Not softness wounded, not dignity under pressure, but judgment. Then she called out, "Qasim." The name cut through the storm. Down by the road, both men jerked around. Qasim's face blanched. Even at that distance, Abdul saw it. The clean terror of a man who had hoped for darkness and found witnesses instead. The other man jumped onto the motorcycle at once. "Go," Qasim shouted. Abdul was already moving downhill. Mud slid under his shoes, splashing up his trousers, but momentum took over. He hit the lower road, just as the motorcycle engine coughed and roared. Abdul grabbed the back rail with one hand and yanked hard. The bike lurched sideways, skidding in the mud. The rider toppled with it, cursing, while Qasim stumbled backward and fell to one knee. Abdul did not touch him at first. He just stood over him in the rain. Qasim looked older than memory, greasier, softer in the face. Fear had a way of revealing what indulgence and cowardice had done to a man's bones. His blue shawl was soaked through. Mud streaked his hands. "Abdul," he panted, trying for injured innocence and failing immediately. "Listen." "No," Abdul said. "You listen." The rider scrambled up and bolted into the trees. Abdul did not chase him. He did not care about hired legs. He cared about the man in the mud. Amina reached them seconds later. Her breathing was uneven, but she never looked away from Qasim. He saw her, and something uglier than fear entered his face. Resentment. As if even now, even at the edge of exposure, some part of him still blamed his sister for not staying buried under the story he had built. "Amina," he said, switching tactics instantly. "You shouldn't be out in this weather." The absurdity of it almost made Abdul laugh. Amina did not. "You told Mama Zuri what words would hurt him enough to stay away," she said. Qasim's eyes flicked to Abdul. Then away. Fast. Guilty. I was trying to protect this family. That sentence detonated something in Abdul so completely that when he spoke, his voice came out frighteningly calm. Which family? Qasim swallowed. "The village was talking," he said. "Your mother was angry. People said Abdul would outgrow this place, outgrow all of us, and if Amina followed him too early, she would become a burden he resented. I thought—" He faltered. "I thought if there was distance first, then maybe later Amina stepped forward. You thought money would come to you." Qasim stared at her. The rain ran down his face like sweat. "Tell him," Amina said. "For once in your life, tell the whole truth before someone else does." Qasim's expression twisted. Shame wrestled greed and lost badly. "Your mother promised help," he muttered. "For debts, for the farm, for my wife's treatment in town." Abdul's jaw hardened. "So you sold your sister?" "I did what men do when there are no choices." Amina's laugh was sharper than the rain. "No, you did what cowards do when money is placed beside conscience." Qasim flinched. Abdul took one step closer. "You intercepted her letters." Qasim shook his head too quickly. "Not all of them." The words slipped out before he could catch them. Amina closed her eyes. There it was. Not denial, not confusion. Admission by panic. "You intercepted them," Abdul repeated. Your mother had already decided, Qasim burst out. She said if you saw the right words, you would stay in Nairobi and build something greater. She said once you became powerful, everyone would benefit, even Amina. Abdul stared at him. The obscenity of that logic almost numbed him. Ruin one woman, kill one child, and call it future planning. Amina's voice shook now, not with weakness but with contained fury. And when I bled in the rain, Qasim's face changed. The guilt there was real, which only made Abdul hate him more. I sent a boy. Qasim whispered. A boy, Amina repeated. To the elder's wife. She never came. Qasim looked down. Mama Zuri said it was better not to interfere until morning. She said sometimes God ends a problem before people make it worse. The world seemed to go silent around them. Abdul felt his hands curl into fists so tight the nails bit skin. Amina stood motionless. For one awful second, Abdul thought the truth might break her in front of them both. Instead, she stepped closer to her brother, until only rain separated them. You heard me call for help, she said. Qasim began to cry. It was not noble grief. It was the frightened, ugly crying of a man who realizes too late that consequences have finally found his address. I was afraid he choked out. Amina nodded slowly, as if confirming a lesson she had lived with for years. Yes, she said, you always were. He reached for her then, maybe out of reflex, maybe to beg, maybe to make himself feel less damned. Amina stepped back before he could touch her. That refusal was colder than any slap. Abdul bent, caught Qasim by the collar, and hauled him halfway upright. You are going back, Abdul said. Qasim struggled weakly, to what Abdul looked straight into his face. To the square, he said. To the people who helped this lie live. To the elder who covered it. To my mother who paid for it. And to every eye that watched my wife break while men like you called it destiny. He released him hard enough to send him stumbling. Qasim looked toward the trees, toward the road, toward any opening that still smelled like escape. There was none. Then Malik's voice came from the ridge above them. More people are coming. Abdul looked up. Shapes were moving through the rain from the village path. 3 men, then 5, then more behind them. Not a rescue party. A wall. And leading them, walking beneath the storm with his staff in hand, and his face set like carved stone, was Mzi Baraka. The men fanned out across the river road like they were arriving to contain danger. But Abdul saw the truth immediately. They were not here to contain danger. They were here to contain exposure. Rain streamed down their shoulders and dripped from the hems of their wrappers and trousers. Some carried sticks. One had a coiled rope slung over his chest. Another held a lantern, protected under a metal shade, its trembling yellow light absurd against the grey violence of the storm. At the front, Mzi Baraka planted his staff into the mud, and looked first at Qasim sprawled near the fallen motorcycle, then at Amina standing upright in the rain, then finally at Abdul. The elder's expression settled into offended authority. This has gone far enough, he said. Abdul almost smiled. That sentence always arrived when truth began costing powerful men something. Amina's face did not change. Water ran down her temples and across her jaw, but she stood as if the rain belonged to her now more than the village did. Far enough, she repeated. You watched them drag me through the square like refuse. Mzi Baraka's eyes flicked toward the men behind him, measuring the effect of her words. You should not speak like this before everyone, he said. And how should I speak? Amina asked. Quietly, gratefully. Like a woman asking permission to describe what was done to her. The men shifted uncomfortably. Abdul noticed it. Not all of them were loyal to the elder. Some were simply trapped by habit, by age hierarchy, by the ancient village disease of confusing obedience with virtue. Kasim, still on his knees, looked between the elder and Abdul with the panicked hunger of a man seeking whichever side would save him. "Mzee," he stammered, "tell them I was trying to settle this privately. That was the wrong plea." Abdul saw Mzee Baraka's face harden, not with compassion but with annoyance. Kasim had ceased to be a useful accomplice the moment his fear became visible. "There is nothing private left," Abdul said. "Not after 10 years. The elder lifted his chin. "Family wounds should not be thrown before a crowd." Abdul stepped forward through the mud until only a few feet separated them. "Then your concern should have started when the crowd was humiliating my wife." The men behind Mzee Baraka murmured. One of them looked away. That was the first crack. The elder tapped his stick once. "You return after 10 years with city power, and now you wish to lecture us on dignity." "No," Abdul said. "I came back to find my wife. Instead, I found a village that had made entertainment out of her suffering." The elder's gaze sharpened. "Careful." Abdul's voice dropped lower. "No. You be careful." The storm deepened around them. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Mzee Baraka made a mistake born from age and entitlement. He looked at Amina as though she were still the easiest person in the scene to silence. "You," he said, "have always been too proud for your own good. If you had accepted correction when your husband left, none of this would have reached such ugliness." That sentence did more than insult her. It exposed the whole rotten structure. Not just that she had been wronged, but that they believed she should have accepted it more gracefully. Amina took one step forward. Abdul felt the air change. Even Kasim looked up. "What correction?" Amina asked. The elder did not answer. She kept going. "Correction for being poor. Correction for marrying above where some people thought I belonged. Correction for carrying my husband's child while his mother decided I was inconvenient. Correction for losing that child alone in mud while this village shut its doors." Each question struck harder than the one before it. By the third, the men behind the elder were no longer looking at her with the usual village gaze reserved for disgraced women. They were looking at her like people watching a grave split open beneath their feet. Mzee Baraka's grip tightened on his stick. "Mind your words." Amina's voice rose for the first time, not shrill, not wild, but clear enough to cut through the rain. "For 10 years I minded my words. I swallowed them until they tasted like blood. Tonight you will hear them." Abdul saw something pass through the men, then shame in some fear, in others resentment in the weakest. He also saw Malik on the ridge above them, still crouched beneath cassava leaves, wide-eyed and soaked, watching as if history itself had stepped into the road. Kasim tried to stand. Abdul did not even look at him when he said, "Stay down," and Kasim stayed down. Mzee Baraka changed tactics. "The woman is emotional." The phrase was so stale, so predictable, that even two of the men behind him exchanged a glance. Amina laughed once, a sharp, broken sound. "No," she said. "I am precise." Then she turned not to Abdul, but to the men the elder had brought. "You all know me," she said. "Some of you ate in my house before Abdul left. Some of your wives borrowed salt from me. Some of you saw me carrying water while pregnant and said nothing. Some of you heard me call for help that night." No one answered. She pointed not wildly, not cruelly, but with surgical accuracy. "You," she said to one man with a rope slung over his chest. "Your daughter had fever 3 years ago, and I sat with her while your wife fetched medicine. You knew what people were doing to me, and you still walked past." The man lowered his eyes. She shifted to another. "And you? Your sister came to my door after her husband beat her. I hid her until morning. Yet when they said I was shameful, you kept your mouth closed to protect your place beside the elder." That man's face tightened. Amina turned slowly, letting all of them feel the weight of recognition. "Do not tell yourselves this story is only about Mama Zuri or Kasim or one letter, or one lost child, she said. It is also about every person who found my pain convenient. That did it. Rain was still falling, but nobody seemed to feel it anymore. Abdul stood completely still, and inside that stillness, something like awe moved through him. This was not the Amina he had left. Or perhaps it was the deepest version of her, the one suffering had stripped down to truth. Not broken. Tempered. Mzee Baraka struck his staff into the mud again. Harder now. Enough, he barked. A woman does not put the whole village on trial. Abdul answered before Amina could. This woman can. The elder swung toward him. You dare? Yes, Abdul said. I dare. His voice carried differently now. Not like a husband defending a wife out of sentiment, but like a man laying legal weight on the table before witnesses. He pointed at Qasim. He admitted helping intercept her letters. Qasim made a weak sound. Quiet, Abdul said. Then he looked at the elder. And he admitted Mamazuri ordered help withheld the night my wife bled. The men behind Mzee Baraka shifted again harder this time. One muttered a curse under his breath. Another stared openly at Qasim with disgust. The elder saw the movement too. His authority was leaking. He tried one final refuge tradition. These are matters for elders, he declared. Not for children, not for market gossips, not for public spectacle. A new voice answered him from the darkness beyond the road. Then perhaps elders should have behaved like elders. Everyone turned. Lantern light caught Nyasha first, soaked, but walking steadily despite her age. Beside her were Kito and Amara, furious, disobedient, and completely unrepentant. More important behind them came villagers. Not all, but enough. Women from the market, 2 younger men from the fields, Mama Salama clutching her head wrap tight under the rain. Even the elder's own wife, slow but unflinching, with 3 other older women at her back. Nyasha stopped a few paces from the road and lifted her chin. I sealed the false letter, she said, and I have carried that sin too long. The words landed like a bell. Mzee Baraka's wife stepped forward next. And I was told not to go to Amina that night, she said. I obeyed. That obedience has shamed me ever since. The elder stared at her as if she had struck him. She did not lower her eyes. Mama Salama cleared her throat loudly, embarrassed already by her own courage. The cassava today was not stolen, she muttered. Half of it came spoiled from my nephew's storage, and we all knew it. That opened the flood. One of the younger men admitted he had carried gossip from the big house for years because it earned him favor. Another confessed that the bank message rejecting Abdul's money had passed through hands connected to Qasim. An older woman said she had seen Mama Zuri's messenger burn one of Amina's letters. A trader swore he heard Qasim boasting drunkenly 2 harvests ago that one good lie had fed his household longer than honesty ever could. Each confession did not merely add information. It shifted power. Mzee Baraka felt it. His face went from command to disbelief to something meaner, panic coated in outrage. Enough, he shouted again. But now the word had lost its force. It no longer sounded like leadership. It sounded like a man trying to close a gate after the herd had already broken through. Abdul turned slowly toward the growing crowd. This is not enough, he said. And then in the mud and rain, with the whole village listening and the storm beating witness on every roof and leaf, he did something nobody expected. He stepped aside. He did not take the center. He gave it to Amina. The gesture was small, devastating, clear. Her eyes widened for half a second. Then she understood. This was not pity, not rescue, not a husband reclaiming authority over his wife's pain. It was space, permission, respect. Amina walked forward until she stood where everyone could see her. Her lip was still swollen. Her wrapper still stained. Abdul's jacket still wrapped around shoulders that had carried 10 years of contempt. But in that moment, she seemed taller than the elder, steadier than the men with sticks, cleaner than every conscience in the rain. She looked first at Qasim. "You were my brother before you were their instrument," she said. "That is why your betrayal was the one that taught me never to confuse blood with love." Qasim began sobbing openly now, but nobody moved to comfort him. Then she looked at Mzi Baraka. "You were the keeper of order," she said. "But the order you kept was the kind that protects the powerful by teaching the wounded to kneel quietly." The elder's face had gone grey. Then she turned to the crowd. "For 10 years she said you called me cursed, shameless, difficult, bitter, discarded. Tonight I return every one of those names to the people who deserved them." No one breathed. "My husband did not abandon me," she continued. "My child did not die by fate. My life was not ruined because I lacked value. It was attacked because some people feared what would happen if a poor woman remained fully loved." The truth of it moved through the villagers like fire finding dry grass. Amina's next words came softer, but they cut deepest of all. "And still," she said, "I did not become what you were." Silence. Pure. Total. Crushing. Then Amara's small voice broke it. "Mama." Every head turned. The girl stood in the rain beside Nyasha, one hand gripping Kito's. Her face was fierce and wet and utterly sincere. "Mama," she said again, louder this time, looking only at Amina. Kito swallowed hard, then lifted his chin and added, "Mama." The sound went through Amina like light through a wound. Her face broke, not into weakness, into human feeling too long denied air. She pressed a hand over her mouth, but tears came anyway. Real tears, not the hidden ones dust had swallowed earlier. These fell openly washed clean by the storm. And in that sacred, unbearable moment, Abdul knew the balance of the whole village had shifted forever. Not because he was rich, not because men had confessed, but because the woman they had tried to reduce to shame was now standing in the center of them all, believed, named, and no longer alone. The rain eased before dawn, but the village did not sleep. No one returned fully to their homes after the confrontation at the river road. Too much had broken open. Too many names had been spoken aloud in front of too many witnesses. The storm had done what storms often do in places built on secrets. It stripped everything loose and left the debris where everyone could see it in the morning. By first light, the square looked like the site of a reckoning. Men dragged benches from the mosque courtyard and placed them in a rough half-circle beneath the broad neem tree at the center of the village. Women arrived in clusters, wrappers tied tightly. Voices low but sharp with sleepless intensity. Children were told to stay away and ignored that instruction with the determination children always have when adults become interesting for the wrong reasons. Traders delayed opening their stalls. Even the goats seemed restless, tugging at ropes as if the tension in the air had entered them too. Abdul had not changed clothes. Mud still marked the hem of his trousers. Rain had dried in salt lines near the collar of his shirt. He stood near the edge of the square, with Kito on one side and Amara on the other. Both children quieter than usual. Both watchful. They had slept a few hours on woven mats inside the trading post, while Nyasha sat against the door like a guard who trusted neither darkness nor dawn. Amina had rested too, though rest was too generous a word for the stillness she entered. She had lain down without removing the jacket Abdul gave her, closed her eyes and drifted in and out of a silence so deep it frightened him. Now she walked beside Nyasha from the veranda toward the gathering, and the whole square seemed to shift around that movement. Yesterday they had stared at her as if shame were a public garment she had no right to remove. This morning they stared because they did not know how to look at her anymore. She was still bruised, still visibly poor, still wearing a faded wrapper and sandals worn thin with years. But the story wrapped around her had changed. Not completed, not healed, but broken open enough that old labels no longer fit cleanly on her skin. Mama Salama was the first to step aside and make room for her. It was a small thing, a trader shifting her basket to clear a path. But in a village, small things were never small. 3 women saw it and copied her. Then 2 men standing near the well moved too. Amina noticed. Abdul saw that she noticed. She did not react outwardly, but something in her shoulders tightened, as if dignity when returned suddenly after years of deprivation could be almost painful to carry. Mzee Baraka sat beneath the neem tree, already his walking stick across his knees, his face hollowed by a night without rest. Beside him sat 2 older men from neighboring compounds who had been hastily summoned to lend the appearance of process. Qasim sat several feet away on a low stool under the eye of 2 younger farmers who had clearly been told not to let him vanish. His eyes were swollen. His clothes were still damp. He looked less like a man now than a bundle of exposed weakness stitched together by fear. Mama Zuri arrived last. She did not hurry. She did not lower her gaze. Even now, with murmurs moving through the crowd like snakes through grass, she walked as if the square belonged to her by birthright, and everyone in it was merely present by permission. Abdul's stomach turned at the sight of her. His mother wore dark indigo, clean and sharply wrapped, despite the storm with gold earrings that caught the pale morning light. She looked dignified, respected, untouched. That Abdul thought was the genius of certain kinds of cruelty. They learned to arrive well-dressed. Her eyes found him first. Not Amina, not the children. Him. "My son," she said, voice carrying just far enough for those nearest to hear. "You return after 10 years and choose chaos over greeting." Abdul felt Quito go still beside him. He stepped forward before the boy could absorb another word of this poisoned theater. "No," Abdul said. "I returned and found the chaos you built." A murmur moved through the square. Mama Zuri's expression barely changed. Only one eyebrow lifted the gesture of a woman insulted by vulgarity, not threatened by truth. "You speak like a stranger," she replied. "I hope the city taught you better than public disrespect?" Abdul almost laughed. Instead, he looked at the old men under the tree. "Is this a hearing or a performance?" One of them, a narrow-faced man named Baba Omari, whom Abdul vaguely remembered from his youth, cleared his throat. "It is a matter of restoring order." Amina, who had now taken her place opposite the elders with Nyasha, standing behind her, and Malik at the edge of the crowd, like a small, fierce witness. No one had officially invited spoke before Abdul could. Order for whom, she asked. The question landed like a stone dropped into a still well. No one answered immediately, because everyone understood the trap inside it. For years, order had meant her silence, her isolation, her usefulness as a warning to other women. Restore order could mean restore that arrangement. Everyone in the square knew it now, even those who would never admit it plainly. Abdul looked at the elders. There will be no order worth restoring until truth is complete. Mama Zuri gave a soft, dismissive click of the tongue. Truth. Such a fashionable word in the mouth of rich men who return to village dust with children that are not theirs and expect simple people to understand complicated lives. The shot was precise. Abdul saw at once what she was doing. She was shifting the center, turning the square away from Amina's suffering and toward the more convenient scandal of Abdul arriving with Quito and Amara. Let the village feed on confusion. Let morality blur. Let complexity become fog. But before he could answer, Amina did something no one expected. She walked to Quito and Amara. Both children looked up at her uncertain. In full view of the square, she knelt despite the discomfort obvious in her body, and straightened the collar of Quito's shirt first, then gently brushed dried mud from Amara's sleeve. The gesture was intimate, ordinary, devastating. Not dramatic enough to feel staged, not sentimental enough to invite mockery. Simply maternal care arriving where slander had expected awkward distance. "These children are under my protection while they are here," Amina said, without turning toward Mama Zuri. "If any adult uses them to hide from what was done to me, let that adult speak clearly so everyone can hear the kind of soul they possess." Silence followed. Pure, sharp silence. Mama Zuri's jaw tightened. It was tiny, almost elegant, but Abdul saw it. The first real crack in her composure. Kito, startled by Amina's words, stood straighter. Amara took Amina's hand for a brief second and squeezed before letting go. Abdul looked at his mother. "You lost the right to hide behind decency the night you let a pregnant woman bleed. That did it." The square inhaled as one. Mama Zuri turned slowly toward him. "Be careful, Abdul." "No," he said. "You be clear." Baba Omari shifted uneasily. "There are accusations here. Serious ones. We must hear testimony, not anger." "Then hear it," Abdul replied. He stepped into the center of the half-circle and looked not at the elders first, but at the villagers. "I sent money to Amina after I received the letter saying she had left me," he said. "Twice in the first year. Both times it was returned with messages claiming she refused it. Last night we learned she never saw that money." Murmurs again, more agitated this time. He turned toward Qasim. "Say it." Qasim licked cracked lips. His gaze darted to Mama Zuri, then to the crowd, then to the mud beneath his stool. "Say it," Abdul repeated. Qasim's shoulders sagged. "The bank agent brought the message to me. First," he muttered, "Mama Zuri said it would only create more trouble if Amina received support while the marriage was unsettled." Amina closed her eyes briefly. One of the women in the crowd spat into the dirt. Abdul pressed on. "And the letters," Qasim's face twisted. "Shame, fear, self-pity. Always self-pity. I intercepted some," he said. "Not all. But enough." A voice from the crowd shouted, "Enough to kill a child!" Qasim flinched as though struck. Mama Zuri rose from her seat. Even standing still, she carried the force of a woman long obeyed. "This is filth," she said coldly. "A desperate man and a disgraced woman gathering the resentments of the poor and calling it truth." A stir of outrage moved through the crowd, but Abdul lifted a hand and the noise dulled. He looked at his mother with a calm so controlled it felt cruel. "Then deny it." She met his gaze. "I deny nothing that protected this family." Amina stared at her. The square went silent again. Not because Mama Zuri had defended herself, because she had not. She had just said the quiet part aloud. Nyasha let out a sound that was almost a sob. Baba Omari sat forward. "What do you mean by that?" Mama Zuri turned toward the elders, and for the first time Abdul saw her drop any pretense of softness. Her voice became the voice of old hierarchy, hard-polished, unapologetic. "I mean, she said that my son was leaving this village to become more than his father ever managed. I would not let him drag a poor, needy girl into a future she was too small to understand. I saw what he could become. She would have chained him to apology and obligation before his first real success." A gasp moved through the women nearest the front. Amina did not move. Mama Zuri went on each word, sharpening her own indictment, without her seeming to notice. When it became clear that Amina would not step aside with dignity, stronger measures became necessary. Distance, silence, adjustment of messages. It happens in every serious family. Only fools call discipline cruelty. Abdul felt something inside him cool into a terrible clarity. All these years he had thought his mother's sin might be rooted partly in panic, partly in prejudice, partly in the frantic selfishness people justify when they are afraid. But this was ideology. She did not regret what she had done. She regretted only that it had become visible. Amina finally spoke. "You call me needy," she said quietly. But every favor I ever accepted from your house came with a hook. Every meal was a reminder, every kindness an invoice. The only thing I ever truly asked from your son was honesty." Mama Zuri's eyes flashed. "And look where honesty has brought us." Amina's chin lifted. "To daylight." That line moved through the square like fire. Malik actually smiled. "Small, fierce, proud." Mama Salama gave an involuntary grunt of approval before catching herself. Baba Omari looked shaken now, old certainty draining visibly from him. "Did you order help withheld on the night Amina lost the child?" Mama Zuri turned toward him with offended disbelief. "I ordered caution. Women bleed. Villages survive. Not every misfortune becomes a moral trial for those who refuse sentiment." The women in the crowd erupted, not all at once, not as one voice, but as many voices breaking years of restraint. Women bleed, she was alone. My own sister died like that. You let her suffer, the square transformed. This was no longer one man defending one wife, no longer a family scandal, no longer even only Amina's story. Mama Zuri had touched a nerve deeper than any one betrayal. She had named women's pain ordinary, acceptable, administratively survivable. And every woman in that village knew exactly what that meant. Baba Omari banged his palm against his knee. Enough. But there was no enough now. Only consequences. Abdul stepped into the noise. His voice neither shouted nor strained, and somehow that made people hear him. "No one here needs my money to know what is right," he said. "But money will no longer protect what is wrong." The crowd quieted. He turned slowly, making sure every key face could see him. The elders, the traders, the farmers, Qasim, his mother. The land title on the South Cassava field that was transferred from Amina's late father to Qasim under pressure, he said, will be challenged before sunset. "I have already called my legal office in Mombasa." Qasim's face went bloodless. "The clinic fund this village has been waiting on for 2 years from my foundation," Abdul continued, "will not pass through Mzee Baraka or anyone appointed by him. A women's board will oversee every coin." Now the elder looked stricken, and the market licenses renewed each season through informal elder approval. Abdul looked around the square. That ends. Transparent records. Open list. No more favors traded for silence. The effect was immediate and violent, not physical but social. Power reassembled itself in everyone's mind. Fast. Not revenge through destruction. Something worse for the guilty. Reform. Mama Zuri stared at him. "You would punish your own blood before strangers." Abdul met her gaze without blinking. "No. I would stop rewarding cruelty because it shares my blood." That line settled over the square like judgment. Then Amina stepped beside him, not behind him, not sheltered by him. Beside him. When she spoke, her voice was tired but steady. "I do not want your house," she said to Mama Zuri. "I do not want your approval. I do not even want the years back, because no one can return the dead." She looked toward Qasim. Then, and pain crossed her face like a passing shadow. "But I want what was taken from me, named for what it was." The entire square listened. "My child did not die by shame," Amina said. "My marriage did not fail by fate. My poverty was not proof of guilt. I was betrayed." Nobody interrupted. "And if this village learns anything from me," she continued, "let it be this: when you call a woman difficult because she keeps standing after being crushed, what you really fear is that she remembers her own worth." By the time she finished, even some of the men were looking at the ground. Baba Omari rose slowly. Age made the movement stiff but not weak. He faced the square. "The elder Mzee Baraka is suspended from community authority, pending formal review by district council." he said, voice unsteady but loud enough. "Qasim will remain under village watch until authorities from town arrive. And Mama Zuri?" He hesitated, perhaps because men like him had never before imagined saying words like these to women like her. "Will have no role in any family or community mediation until this matter is fully examined." No one cheered. This was not that kind of moment. Justice was entering too late to feel clean. Still, Abdul saw it in the crowd, in the lifted chins of the women, in the stunned face of the elder's wife, in Malik's fierce eyes, in the way Quito and Amara looked at Amina like children who had just learned that truth can stand up and speak. Not triumph, but shift. And for the first time in 10 years, the balance of power in the village had moved away from those who hid behind silence. By the third day, the village had grown quieter. Not peaceful. Quiet in the way a body grows quiet after a wound has finally been opened and cleaned. The shouting in the square was over. The public confessions had already travelled beyond the village to the district office. Mzee Baraka no longer sat beneath the neem tree, giving advice no one questioned. Qasim had stopped trying to run. Mama Zuri remained inside the big house, receiving no visitors except the lawyer Abdul had summoned from Mombasa and the women from the district council who had arrived with notebooks, clipped voices, and the kind of attention power could not charm. But none of that gave Abdul the one thing he wanted most. Amina still had not said she would come with him. The old house where she lived stood at the edge of the village, near the cassava fields, a little beyond the baobab where she had once fallen in the rain. The roof sagged on one side. One wall still carried the stain of a rainy season flood. The doorway leaned slightly, as if even the wood had spent too many years learning how to endure without help. Abdul stood outside it at sunrise, with a hammer in one hand and a bundle of replacement nails tucked into his pocket. Quito stood beside him, holding a small tin cup of bent nails they had sorted the night before. Amara sat on an overturned basin under the shade, pulling dry palm fibers apart for patching and pretending not to be thrilled by any task that made her feel useful. Malik, who had attached himself to the household with the quiet loyalty of a half-starved dog, finally finding warmth, crouched on the packed earth and shaved strips of wood with a borrowed knife. Inside the house, Amina moved softly. She had let them help with repairs. That Abdul had learned was not the same as letting them in. "Pass me the longer plank," he said to Quito. The boy handed it up without a word. He had grown even quieter in the days since the hearing. Not unhappy, just watchful in a deeper way, as if he were studying the shape of healing and trying to understand whether it always looked this awkward from the outside. Abdul climbed the stool and pressed the plank into place along the weak section of roof beam. When he hammered the first nail in, the sound cracked through the morning like a declaration. He was still here. That mattered more than anything he could say. The first day after the hearing, Abdul had gone to Amina and told her plainly, "When you are ready, I want you to come with me." A reasonable offer. A loving one, perhaps. But the second the words left his mouth, he knew they were wrong. Come with me. As if healing meant movement toward his world, his house, his city, his terms. Amina had looked at him then with tired eyes and said, "You still speak as though home is wherever you stand." He had not answered because the truth in that sentence had shamed him. So on the second day, he had not asked again. He had simply stayed. He helped Malik clear brush from the path. He bought timber from town, but had it delivered without spectacle. He accompanied Nyasha to the clinic and arranged long-delayed medicine for her joints without announcing it to the village. He sat outside Amina's house at dusk, while Amara dozed against his side, and Quito carved lines into the dirt with a stick, and he did not demand conversation. He was learning the difference between rescue and presence. By mid-morning, the heat thickened. Sweat darkened Abdul's shirt. Dust clung to the backs of his hands and to the line of his neck. His expensive watch sat forgotten on the windowsill inside, because it felt obscene here, measuring hours in a place where years had been stolen. Amina stepped into the doorway carrying a clay jug of water. "Enough for now," she said. Abdul climbed down from the stool. His shoulders ached. His palms were raw. The pain pleased him more than it should have. Amara ran over first, and Amina poured water into a metal cup for her. Then for Quito. Then for Malik, who accepted it with the stunned caution of a child still unused to being served before everyone else. Only after the children drank did Amina fill the cup again and hold it toward Abdul. He took it carefully. Their fingers brushed. A small thing, still enough to alter the air. "You should rest before the sun turns cruel," she said. Abdul drank, then wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "I've survived worse." Amina's gaze lingered on him for a moment. "Have you?" He looked at her over the rim of the cup. The question was not about heat. Not really. Before he could answer, Nyasha appeared on the path, leaning on a walking stick Malik had cut for her. "Visitors," she announced grimly. Abdul turned. At the gate stood two men from Mombasa in pale shirts and polished shoes already coated with village dust. One was his lawyer. The other was a senior manager from his foundation. Behind them idled a vehicle too shiny for the road it had traveled. Amina's face closed. Abdul saw it happen instantly. The wall, the withdrawal, the old injury resurfacing under the skin. His manager lifted a folder and called out, "Sir, we have the transfer documents and the relocation options ready." "Relocation options?" The phrase landed like an insult. Amina stepped back into the shadow of the doorway. Abdul handed the cup to Quito and walked to the gate before another word could be spoken. "What are you doing here?" he asked quietly. The manager blinked. "You requested papers for Amina's housing, the educational trust for the children, and a transport schedule back to Mombasa. We thought I know what you thought." The lawyer wiser said nothing. Abdul lowered his voice further. "You will take the vehicle and wait by the mosque." The manager looked confused. "Sir, if we finalize things today, there is nothing to finalize today." A flicker of frustration crossed the man's face. He was efficient, loyal, and completely wrong. "Sir," he tried again with respect, "remaining here indefinitely is impractical." "Your meetings in Nairobi." Abdul stared at him until the rest of the sentence died. Then he said very clearly, "This is the meeting that matters." The lawyer almost smiled. The manager nodded, stiffly, chastened, and retreated toward the vehicle. As they left, Abdul felt Amina's gaze on his back. When he turned, she was still standing in the doorway. Not softer, not warm, but assessing. The children, sensing the adult weather, had shifted again, drifted toward the side of the house with Malik. Quito pretended to inspect the patched roof. Amara whispered something to Malik that made the boy huff out the beginning of a laugh. Abdul walked back slowly. Amina set the empty jug down near the step. "You could have gone with them," she said. "Yes." "But you didn't." "No." She looked at him for a long moment. Why? He could have answered with love, with guilt, with apology. All were true. None were enough. Because I think for a long time, Abdul said I believed responsibility meant providing from a distance, sending money, solving problems, moving people to safety. Amina folded her arms, loosely waiting. "But distance is what took you from me in the first place," he continued. "And now, every time I try to fix this by deciding where you should go or how quickly things should change, I hear the same arrogance hiding inside my good intentions." Something moved in her face, then pain mixed with recognition. "So I'm staying," he said. "Not because I think suffering here makes me noble. Not because I expect forgiveness as payment. I'm staying because you should not have to rebuild your life around my convenience again." The word had hung between them. Amina looked down at her hands. They were cleaner now than the day he arrived, but still rough, still marked by labor the city would never understand. "When you first came back," she said quietly, I thought you would do exactly what rich men do when guilt becomes uncomfortable. Abdul almost smiled without humor. Sweep in, make a promise, offer a bigger house, then disappear once the story feels less urgent. Yes, that sounds accurate. It sounds common. He accepted that, too. A goat bleated somewhere beyond the cassava field. A woman called to her daughter near the well. Life was happening around them with stubborn indifference, as if the universe refused to pause for emotional clarity. Amina leaned one shoulder against the doorframe. I do not know how to walk into your world, she said. You don't have to. It is not only that. She lifted her eyes to his. I do not know who I am inside love anymore, Abdul. I know who I am inside survival. I know who I am when I must endure humiliation, hunger, gossip, work, loss. But being cared for. A bitter breath escaped her. That feels more frightening than pain. He did not rush to answer. Because that, too, he understood more than he wished. Power had taught him to trust control. Wealth had taught him to trust preparation. But tenderness, that required surrender to uncertainty. It required showing up without guarantees. It required allowing another person to matter more than your schedule, your ego, your fear of being helpless. It frightens me too, he admitted. Amina studied him. You, she asked, almost skeptical. Yes, why? Because if I love you properly this time, I cannot hide behind success when it fails. The honesty of that settled something. Not solved, not healed, but settled. Amina lowered her gaze again. The children need stability. They do. They are already watching us too closely. Abdul glanced toward the side yard. Quito was very obviously pretending not to listen. Amara was not even pretending. That nearly made him laugh. Amina saw it too, and a real smile touched her mouth for the briefest second before vanishing. Then she said, I will not leave the village because everyone suddenly feels sorry for me. I know. I will not enter your house in Mombasa as a woman people whisper was rescued. I know, and I will not be loved out of guilt. Abdul stepped closer, stopping still a careful distance away. Then don't accept guilt, he said. Accept only what survives it. The words surprised both of them. Amina's breath caught slightly. From the side yard came the clatter of a dropped tool. Amara, who had absolutely been listening, suddenly developed deep interest in a broken bucket. Abdul and Amina both ignored that. A long silence followed. Then Amina said the thing he had not been ready for. If you stay, she asked how long. He answered without hesitation. As long as it takes for you to believe I'm not leaving at the first sign of discomfort. The simplicity of it seemed to strike deeper than any promise could have. She looked at the unfinished roof, the stacked timber, the children. Nyasha lowering herself carefully onto a stool near the shade, Malik carrying wood as if he had belonged to this household all his life. Then she looked back at Abdul. This is not a test you pass in one speech, she said. I know. Or 1 week. I know. Or by repairing a roof. He glanced upward. That one still feels useful. Her mouth betrayed her again. Another almost smile. Then she nodded once. Small, grave, real. You may stay, she said. Not come back, not be forgiven. Stay. It was not romance. It was more valuable. Permission to prove himself in time instead of in declarations. From the side yard, Amara whispered loudly, I knew she would say yes. Quito muttered, She didn't say yes to everything. Malik, learning fast, said, Still counts. Amina closed her eyes briefly, as if deciding whether to scold them. Abdul looked away to hide his smile. Then Amina bent, picked up the hammer he had left near the step, and held it out to him. "The back wall leans after rain," she said. "If you are staying, there is more work." Abdul took the hammer from her hand. "Yes," he said, "there is." And for the first time since returning to the village, he understood that healing would not come like thunder. It would come like this through labor, presence, awkward honesty, children listening when they should not. Old walls repaired one beam at a time, and love learning to stand where apology alone had failed. 3 months later, the village looked different in ways no stranger would have noticed. The neem tree still cast the same wide shadow across the square. The market still filled first with the smell of cassava flour-fried plantains, soap dust, and sweat. Children still raced each other down the red paths barefoot, shouting over goats and bicycle bells. Women still balanced impossible loads on their heads and carried conversations sharp enough to peel bark from trees. The sky still turned copper before sunset and silver before rain. But under those familiar surfaces, something fundamental had shifted. The clinic had reopened with 2 trained nurses from town and 1 midwife from the district who walked through the village with the kind of calm authority that made careless men lower their voices without understanding why. The elder's chair beneath the neem tree was no longer occupied by one untouchable man. A rotating council now met there twice a week, and for the first time in the village's memory, 3 of the 7 members were women. Market fees were written on a public board instead of whispered in private exchanges. Land disputes no longer disappeared into family favors. Girls who once crossed the square with lowered eyes now paused openly to read notices pinned outside the trading post. And at the edge of the village near the baobab and the cassava fields, a house that had once looked like it was apologizing for existing now stood straight again. Not luxurious, not polished. Alive. The roof no longer sagged. The cracked wall had been reinforced and replastered. New shutters painted deep green framed the windows. A rain barrel stood beside the doorway. Herbs grew in neat clay pots near the step. A woven mat, bright with red and gold patterns, dried in the sun across a low fence. Where Amara insisted it made the whole place look like a home that smiles. Abdul was on the roof that morning, securing the last corner of a shade awning over the small front veranda. He was sweating through a plain cotton shirt. His hands had roughened over the months. The expensive softness that once followed him everywhere had burned away under work, sundust, and repetition. He still took calls from Nairobi and Mombasa when necessary. He still signed papers, made decisions, redirected funds, and managed the empire he had built. But none of that mattered here as much as the fact that he now knew how to reinforce a beam, clean a gutter bargain for timber without insulting a carpenter, and tell by smell alone whether rain would reach the house before dark. Below him, Quito was sorting nails into jars by size with the seriousness of a small engineer. Amara sat cross-legged near the herb pots, bossing Malik through the process of painting a wooden sign she insisted should hang above the kitchen doorway. "It should say something beautiful," she declared. Malik snorted. "People enter kitchens to eat, not read poetry. That is because you have no imagination. I have survival. That is not the same thing. It has worked longer." Quito, without looking up, said, "Spell everything before you paint it." Amara rolled her eyes. "I know how to spell. That is not what happened with welcome last week. It was 1 letter. You missed 3. Malik laughed out loud. The sound made Abdul look down. That still mattered to him. Malik laughed more easily now. Not all the time. Not without caution. But enough to prove that safety, when repeated often enough, could begin to feel believable. He was cleaner, stronger, sharper in school, and far more opinionated than he had been when he first crouched in the cassava leaves watching adults destroy one another. Amina had made space for him in the house so naturally that one evening Abdul realized no one had discussed whether Malik was staying anymore. He simply had. Family had widened around him without announcement. Amina stepped out onto the veranda, carrying a basin of washed clothes, and Abdul's chest tightened in the old familiar way that still caught him by surprise. Not because she looked fragile, because she no longer did. She was still lean, still dark-skinned and fine-boned, still marked by years no apology could erase. But the defeated stillness that had once lived in her posture was gone. She moved with quiet certainty now. Her voice no longer measured every word for danger. Her face no longer seemed braced for insult before entering public space. Even her clothing had changed, not in cost, but in presence. Today she wore a clean wrap dress of indigo and white, and a scarf tied loosely over her hair. Simple, strong, unhidden. When she lifted her face to the sun, Abdul saw peace there. Not complete peace, but earned peace. She glanced up toward the roof. "If you fall, I am not catching you." Abdul smiled. "That sounds like concern wearing sharp shoes. It sounds like honesty. That too." Amara clapped dramatically. "You two speak like old people who secretly like each other." Amina gave her a look. Secretly, Malik nearly choked, laughing. Even Quito smiled this time. That more than anything told Abdul how far they had come. Quito did not give smiles cheaply. He handed them out only when trust had already done most of the work. Abdul climbed down from the roof and landed lightly in the packed earth of the yard. Amina handed him a cloth from the basin without ceremony. He took it the same way, as if this quiet exchange had always belonged to them. There were still moments between them that ached. Some nights Amina woke from sleep too quickly, breathing hard, old memory rising before present safety could steady it. Some afternoons Abdul said something practical in the wrong tone and saw her go distant, not because she feared him, but because the past had trained her to distrust certainty, spoken from a man's mouth. Sometimes guilt still caught him unawares when he saw her pause near the baobab, when he watched the midwife greet a pregnant woman at the clinic, when he imagined the child they never got to hold. Healing had not erased grief. It had only taught grief where to sit. Amina began hanging the laundry on the line. Abdul moved to help without asking. They worked side by side, clipping cloth into morning light, while the children argued over the sign in the yard. After a few minutes, Amina said quietly, "Your mother is leaving today." Abdul clipped a shirt to the line and kept his eyes on it. Yes, Mama Zuri had lost almost everything that once made her untouchable. Not wealth in the crude sense. She still owned land jewelry reputation in circles outside the village. But reputation inside the village was different now. The district review had confirmed the manipulation of messages, the interference in property matters, and the suppression of medical aid. She would not face prison. There had been too many layers, too many old silences, too much evidence blurred by time and power. But she had lost authority, social standing, and worst of all, to her moral control over the story of the family. She had requested a final conversation with Abdul before leaving for Dar es Salaam to live with a cousin. He had agreed, not out of softness, out of completion. "She asked if you would come too," he said. Amina hung a cloth carefully and answered without hesitation, "No." He looked at her. "I told her you wouldn't." Amina met his gaze. And she said you always did mistake firmness for virtue." Amina gave a short laugh. "That sounds like her." Abdul hesitated. "She also said," he continued, "that one day I will resent the life I chose here." Amina's hand stilled on the line for half a second. Then she resumed pinning cloth into place. "And what did you say Abdul watched the fabric move in the wind?" "I told her this is the first life I've chosen without lying to myself." Amina's face softened. Not dramatically, just enough. When the laundry was done, they walked to the road together, not touching at first. Then, as they neared the main path, Amara ran ahead, and Quito followed with Malik, giving the adults a little unspoken distance. Abdul did not miss the intention. Children always noticed more than they were credited for. At the big house gate, Mama Zuri stood beside a waiting car. The house behind her seemed smaller somehow, or perhaps power looked smaller once it no longer controlled the room around it. She wore another dark wrapper, elegant as always, and a face composed with the discipline of someone who would rather be carved from stone than seen bleeding. When she saw Amina beside Abdul, her eyes sharpened but did not widen. She had expected this. She had understood at some point that the woman she tried to erase had become the axis around which her son's moral life now turned. "My son Mama Zuri said." Abdul inclined his head. Nothing more. Her gaze shifted to Amina. "You have won." Amina's answer came gently, which made it more powerful. "No, I survived." Something unreadable crossed Mama Zuri's face, perhaps the closest she would ever come to being pierced by truth. She turned back to Abdul. "Blood is a difficult thing to outgrow." He held her gaze. "So is conscience." For a second he thought she might say something sharper, something vicious enough to leave one final wound. But maybe exile, even a social one, had done. What love never could, it had introduced her to limits. Or maybe she was simply tired. At last she said, "Take care of the children." Abdul's voice remained level. "I will." Her eyes flicked once more toward Amina, then toward the road, then to the house that no longer answered to her the way it once had. Finally she entered the vehicle without another word. The car pulled away in a slow cloud of dust. No one waved. For a long time after it disappeared, the road remained quiet. Then Abdul exhaled. Not in relief, in release. Amina looked at him. "How do you feel?" He considered the question honestly. Like grief can be lighter without becoming small. Amina nodded, as if she understood perfectly. They began walking back toward the house. Halfway there, Amara and Malik came running from the yard, dragging the painted sign between them with ridiculous ceremony. Quito followed, carrying 2 nails and a hammer, resigned to the chaos. "We finished it," Amara announced. Malik muttered, "We survived it." Quito held up the hammer. "Where should it go?" Abdul looked at the sign. The letters were slightly uneven. One line slanted. Malik had clearly corrected part of Amara's spelling, and then made the second word messier in revenge. But the message was readable. "No one eats alone here." Abdul read it once, then again, and something in him broke open so quietly it almost felt like peace. Amina took the sign from the children and ran her thumb over the painted wood. "No one eats alone here," she repeated. Her voice trembled just slightly. Abdul saw the meaning arrive in all of them at once. Not just meals, not just the house, not just the joke. A creed, a reversal. The opposite of everything that had been done to her in silence, exile, hunger, and abandonment. Quito looked up at Abdul. Above the kitchen, Abdul shook his head. "No," he said, "above the front door." The children grinned. Together they carried the sign to the house. Abdul held it in place while Quito passed nails, Malik steadied the stool, and Amara issued useless but enthusiastic instructions. When it was done, Amina stepped back beside Abdul and looked up at it as the late morning light spread over the fresh painted wood. The house was modest, the future uncertain, the grief real, the love no longer hidden. And in that moment, standing shoulder to shoulder while 3 children filled the yard with noise and life, Abdul understood something he had spent 10 years. Home was not the place to play. It was the people who had finally learned not to. Sometimes the deepest wounds in life do not come from enemies. They come from the people who should have protected us, believed us, or stood beside us when we were too weak to stand alone. That is what makes betrayal so devastating. It does not only break the heart, it can distort truth, steal years, and make innocent people carry shame that was never there. because it does more than expose the guilty. It gives the wounded back their name, their dignity, and their voice. Amina's journey teaches us that survival is not weakness. Enduring cruelty without becoming cruel is a form of greatness many people will never understand. Abdul's journey teaches us that love is not proved by words, money, or regret alone. Real love is presence. Real responsibility is staying. Real healing begins when people stop asking who was right and start asking who was hurt. How do we make sure they are never left alone? If this story touched your heart, tell me in the comments what moment moved you the most, and what would you have done in Abdul or Amina's place? And if you believe stories about truth, justice, healing, and second chances still matter, subscribe to the channel and stay with us for more powerful journeys like this.